It didn't immediately grab headlines. There was no dramatic political showdown. Instead, it began with a quiet administrative decision, a bureaucratic maneuver that turned the entire agricultural machinery industry upside down. John Deere, an iconic name in American farming, suddenly found itself paralyzed. Factories fell silent, dealerships emptied, and farmers waited in vain for parts. Canada didn't resort to force or threats. They simply changed regulations, creating logistical hurdles that choked the supply of essential components. Meanwhile, global competitors swiftly capitalized on the chaos. No one had foreseen it, neither John Deere nor Washington, leaving American farmers scrambling. Why did Canada use bureaucracy as a weapon? How did China and South Korea turn this turmoil into opportunity? And what does it mean for American agriculture when its most trusted brand falters? John Deere's reliance on Canadian suppliers had once been viewed as a smart strategic move, until border slowdowns turned that strategy into a serious liability. As delays dragged on, some factories began disassembling half-built machines just to clear space on the production floor. This wasn't a minor disruption anymore. It was a manufacturing crisis. Workers slowly realized this was more than a bump in the road. It was a deeper, systemic collapse. Confidence in the company began to erode, and talk of job cuts grew louder. By the end of the first month, layoffs began. Hundreds of employees were sent home with vague promises of a return, promises few believed. Morale plummeted. For the first time in generations, John Deere seemed vulnerable. Then, things got worse. The crisis spread to dealerships. With factories idled, dealers faced their own turmoil. In rural America, John Deere wasn't just a brand, it was the backbone of farming communities. But that trust was shattered as shelves emptied. Across the Midwest, farmers lined up at local dealers, desperate for replacement parts to keep their aging equipment running. But there was nothing to give. Dealers, once proud symbols of the Deere legacy, now had to turn loyal customers away. Every day, machines sat idle, farmers lost money, and the system meant to support them was nowhere to be found. Some farmers had already pre-ordered new equipment, or parts, only to learn their shipments were delayed indefinitely. In close-knit rural communities, this felt like a betrayal. The once unwavering trust in John Deere's iconic green and yellow began to fade. Dealers tried to reassure customers, but with little guidance from corporate leadership, they had few answers. Financial pressure mounted as sales dropped. Some dealers even considered carrying rival brands just to survive. Farmers who had been loyal for generations started looking elsewhere. The emotional toll was significant. Farmers felt abandoned and dealers felt helpless. This wasn't just a supply issue, it was a breakdown of trust. Years of loyalty were unraveling, not just because of delays, but because of what many saw as John Deere's failure to take responsibility. In these communities, it wasn't just business. It was deeply personal. As rural faith in the brand crumbled, Canada's strategic plan continued to unfold. We've investigated the policies and followed the economic chain reaction to bring you the full picture of how Canada's quiet move sent shockwaves through the U.S. agricultural industry. If you value this kind of in-depth reporting, be sure to like and subscribe. Canada's masterstroke was a policy trap John Deere never saw coming. As the company scrambled, Canada kept tightening the squeeze, legally and strategically. This wasn't just a disruption, it was a long game of dominance, hidden beneath layers of regulation. The goal wasn't simply to cause delays, it was to pressure U.S. manufacturers into rethinking their dependence on cross-border supply chains. Mark Carney's strategy was clear: push American companies toward domestic production by targeting their weakest link, logistics. By strategically slowing the flow of parts at a critical moment, Canada forced companies like John Deere to consider reshoring operations or face recurring crises. Publicly, Canada looked composed and calculated, while the U.S. appeared caught off guard and reactive. At its core, this wasn't just about manufacturing, it was about rewriting the rules of economic dependence. But even as Deere tried to recover, a new threat emerged. This time, from within. Farmers were walking away. Dealers had nothing left to offer. And in rural America, loyalty is everything, until the machines stop working. John Deere has always been more than a company. It's a symbol of dependability, a cornerstone of every planting and harvest season. So when equipment began to fail and replacement parts stopped arriving, frustration quickly turned into panic. Farmers depend on their tractors, balers, and harvesters to keep operations moving, but the ongoing supply chain breakdown meant that critical components were simply unavailable. Dealers who once took pride in always having the right part on hand were now empty-handed. Showrooms, once vibrant with the latest models, felt gutted, like the soul of the business had vanished. Across the Midwest, the reports were the same: engines missing pistons, hydraulics without pumps. Digital systems left useless because software modules were stuck at the border. With weather patterns growing more erratic and costs rising, farmers faced a devastating new challenge: equipment that couldn't be fixed. One dealership owner in rural Nebraska described it bluntly. "We have the showroom, we have the brand, but we've got nothing to sell. It's like being a bank with no money." Longtime John Deere customers, some loyal for decades, began to search for other options, often reluctantly. Farmers scoured online classifieds and forums for used parts or non-Deere alternatives. Others considered making the difficult switch to foreign brands despite deep emotional ties. As one Kansas farmer put it, "I bled green for 30 years. But that doesn't fix a broken planter when spring comes." The damage to local dealerships was devastating. Customers canceled pre-orders, others traveled to nearby counties or even states hoping to find inventory. Trust built over generations was shattered as dealers struggled to explain why they couldn't deliver. And as John Deere faltered, foreign brands stepped in. Manufacturers from China and Europe seized the moment with precision. Brands like BYD and Kubota, once fringe players in the US market, suddenly became highly sought after. They had what Deere didn't: available machines, competitive pricing, and functioning parts. Chinese manufacturers, particularly agile and responsive, quickly stocked rural showrooms. European brands like Claas and Fendt, known for premium equipment, expanded their presence and gained new traction. The appeal was obvious. These brands could deliver now. Farmers needed results, not promises. "When your crops are dying, you just need something that works," said an Oklahoma dealer. What once was unshakable brand loyalty began shifting toward pragmatism. Farmers who would have laughed at foreign-made equipment were now buying it, and not just out of desperation. The new machines were well-built, efficient, and sometimes even ahead of Deere in features and service support. As these overseas brands gained ground, U.S. states, watching their local economies strain, began stepping in to respond to the crisis themselves. With federal leadership frozen and U.S. manufacturers in turmoil, state governors stepped into the vacuum. In the heartland, where farms and factories are economic lifelines, waiting for Washington wasn't an option. Governors from key Midwestern states like Michigan, Iowa, and Ohio began working directly with Canadian trade officials to keep parts moving. The irony was unmistakable. These states had overwhelmingly supported Trump, drawn to his promises of revitalizing American industry. Now, behind his administration's back, their leaders were negotiating foreign trade workarounds just to keep their economies afloat. They weren't just asking, they were pleading. Without parts, entire communities were at risk of collapse. Some states even sought deals with foreign manufacturers to build new plants locally, bypassing tariffs entirely. It wasn't a political move, it was survival. While Washington kept talking trade wars, state leaders took action. The economic dominoes fall. John Deere's production collapse didn't just stall machines, it shook the foundation of the Midwest. Communities that had grown around green and yellow factories were suddenly gripped by soaring unemployment. The impact went beyond lost paychecks. It stripped towns of their identity. As layoffs mounted, political allegiances began to shift. Voters who once stood firmly behind Trump's trade policies were now questioning everything. What were meant to be protective tariffs ended up crippling one of America's most iconic brands. Retaliatory trade measures, intended to spur domestic growth, had done the opposite. Local businesses suffered. Diners near the factories shut early. Retail shops tied to farm incomes saw sales crash. Entire local economies, once stable thanks to Deere, found themselves sliding towards stagnation. At first, blame was aimed squarely at Canada, but as the dust settled, frustration turned inward toward Washington. Promises of an economic renaissance had instead delivered chaos. Farmers and factory workers felt betrayed. Grassroots movements began to emerge. People weren't asking for slogans, they wanted solutions. Town halls grew tense as rural lawmakers, once proud backers of the tariffs, dodged angry questions. The policy's flaws were becoming undeniable. Instead of protecting U.S. jobs, tariffs had made it more appealing for companies to offshore manufacturing. Even John Deere quietly explored overseas options. Public anger turned into organized pushback. Demonstrations, community meetings, and voter initiatives began demanding practical economic strategies, not ideological purity. A new mood was settling across the heartland, one of realism over rhetoric. Deere's desperate gamble. In the middle of this growing crisis, John Deere tried to mount a comeback. Faced with collapsing trust, the company finally announced plans to localize production, retrofitting plants in Iowa and Illinois to restart domestic manufacturing. But the move came far too late. Restarting idle factories was no simple fix. Machinery needed costly overhauls. Previously laid-off workers had to be rehired and retrained. parts suppliers, many of whom had already committed to foreign manufacturers, were hesitant to return. The result was chaos and confusion. The scramble drained Deere's finances and eroded investor confidence. The company's once stable stock continued its downward slide. Internal criticism grew louder. Board members began openly questioning management's lack of foresight and clumsy crisis response. In the end, Deere's delayed gamble looked more like damage control than strategy. And as it struggled to regain its footing, the broader question remained. Had the brand simply waited too long to change? Desperation, not strategy. The push to ramp up domestic production looked less like a calculated plan and more like a last-ditch attempt to stay relevant as Deere's crisis worsened. Meanwhile, other nations began to see potential advantages in America's industrial disarray. Japan's strategic reckoning. Japan, heavily dependent on the U.S. market, found itself in a precarious position. What once was a crucial trade partner had become a significant threat. Japanese automakers such as Toyota and Honda have long relied on American consumers to fuel their global dominance. But with the U.S. now imposing harsh tariffs, Japan is grappling with a severe challenge: how to protect its automotive industry when its top customer turns hostile. Caught between economic protection and preserving diplomatic ties, the Japanese government has scrambled to act. Emergency meetings were held with executives from major manufacturers like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan to chart a path forward. While some lawmakers floated retaliatory tariffs, fears of escalating the trade war have kept those ideas on hold. Instead, Japan is emphasizing two key strategies: localized production, building more cars within the U.S. to sidestep tariffs. Toyota is fast-tracking its Kentucky plant expansion, aiming for a 20% production boost within 3 years. Honda may open a new electric vehicle facility in Ohio, diversify markets, reducing reliance on the U.S. by increasing exports to Southeast Asia and Europe. While these efforts may cushion the blow, they underscore a larger truth: Japan's auto sector must evolve or risk falling behind. Public sentiment in Japan is shifting. Initially seen as a routine trade dispute, the tariffs' impact is now hitting home. Jobs are at risk, workers are growing anxious, and labor unions are pressing for government action. Protests are becoming more frequent, with citizens demanding policies that prioritize Japanese workers over U.S. trade appeasement. Opportunistic neighbors, China and South Korea. While Japan scrambles to adjust, China and South Korea are making swift, strategic moves. Both countries, long known for their manufacturing prowess, are stepping in to fill the void left by Japan in the U.S. automotive market. Leading the way are Chinese brands like BYD and NEIO, aggressively expanding in the U.S. BYD has announced 2 new plants in Texas and California, targeting the affordable EV segment. NEIO is working with local dealerships to broaden its presence, offering incentives to stock their vehicles. Their approach is clear: flood the market with cost-effective, dependable EVs, while legacy automakers are still adapting. South Korea, meanwhile, is taking a more cautious but equally effective route. Hyundai, already well established in the U.S., is increasing output at its Alabama and Georgia facilities and accelerating its broader production plans. Hyundai's advantage and Asia's agility. Hyundai's launch of a new electric crossover is aimed squarely at eco-conscious buyers seeking alternatives to legacy brands. By keeping a robust manufacturing footprint in the U.S., Hyundai sidesteps the tariff challenges crippling Japanese rivals. What sets China and South Korea apart is their adaptability. Instead of resisting the shifting trade landscape, they're leaning into it, investing in U.S.-based production and partnering with American suppliers. This strategy not only reinforces their economic presence, but also builds trust with American consumers frustrated by rising prices from traditional automakers. Europe's strategic crisis. As Asia adjusts swiftly, Europe is stumbling. Unlike their nimble Asian counterparts, European luxury automakers are stuck in a strategic bind that could redefine their future in the global market. Luxury in the crosshairs. European prestige brands like Mercedes, BMW, and Audi, long-standing symbols of performance and refinement in the US, are now in trouble. Tariffs have unraveled their pricing models and forced a fundamental reassessment of their identities. Unlike mass-market brands, they can't simply shift production stateside without compromising the precision and quality that define them. Building in America could dilute their luxury image, but absorbing the costs risks making their vehicles unaffordable. Mercedes, for instance, is staring down a 15% price increase per vehicle, pushing even entry-level models beyond reach for many. Some automakers are considering scaling back U.S. operations. BMW is exploring cuts to its American lineup, focusing only on high-margin models. Audi is trying to soften the blow with more flexible leasing options to reduce the burden on consumers. But the core issue remains how to maintain brand prestige without pricing themselves out of the market. If they stay the course, they risk fading relevance. If they adapt too much, they risk losing what makes them special. Detroit's second wind. While Europe stumbles, American automakers see a rare opening. Long counted out, Detroit is poised for a comeback. The upheaval in global manufacturing has created a once-in-a-generation opportunity for U.S. brands to reclaim dominance on home soil. A rewired industry. The automotive world is being reshaped, not just disrupted. What started as a targeted tariff policy has snowballed into a full-scale realignment of global auto production. One major consequence, the rise of American-made EVs. With imported vehicles now dramatically more expensive, domestic companies like Ford and GM are going all in on U.S. electric vehicle production. Billions are being poured into new EV facilities, banking on the idea that American consumers will choose locally built, affordable options over pricey foreign models. Consumer attitudes are shifting too. Buying American is no longer just patriotic, it's practical. For the first time in decades, local brands are winning not on nostalgia, but on value. The road ahead. The auto industry, as we knew it, is gone. The future is uncertain, but one thing is clear. A new industrial order is emerging. As agriculture and manufacturing realign, questions remain. Can John Deere recover? What does this upheaval mean for rural America? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives. We're tracking every turn, so you don't have to. Canada's response. A strategic pivot amid U.S. manufacturing turmoil. As John Deere struggles to maintain relevance amidst U.S. manufacturing chaos and shifting global trade dynamics, Canada has seized the moment to reposition itself, not as a bystander, but as a strategic alternative. While American industrial policy becomes increasingly volatile, Canada is presenting itself as a stable, innovation-friendly, and labor-secure environment for advanced manufacturing and agricultural technology. Federal and provincial governments have launched a coordinated effort to attract investment from companies looking to relocate or diversify production away from the U.S. Ottawa's offer. Certainty, incentives, and skilled labor. The Canadian government has responded by offering a trifecta: policy predictability, generous subsidies, and access to a highly skilled, union-trained workforce. In a veiled invitation to manufacturers like John Deere, officials have emphasized Canada's robust infrastructure, strong ties to European and Asian markets, and progressive trade agreements like CETA and the CPTPP, advantages the U.S. increasingly lacks due to isolationist policies. Rebuilding agritech in Canada. John Deere's vulnerability has spurred Canadian ambitions to build a homegrown agritech ecosystem. Provinces like Ontario and Saskatchewan are investing in domestic precision agriculture startups, green energy farming tech, and autonomous equipment systems. In Regina and Waterloo, agricultural robotics labs are seeing a surge in funding, some of it redirected from American partnerships deemed too risky under the current climate. Welcoming Deere on Canada's terms. Though John Deere hasn't announced a relocation, Canadian officials have reportedly held quiet talks with the company about expanding its manufacturing footprint north of the border. But this time, Canada is being strategic. Any expansion would come with conditions, local job guarantees, partnerships with Canadian suppliers, and commitments to build for both North American and global export from Canadian soil. A new industrial north. In contrast to America's reactive, fragmented approach, Canada is positioning itself as the calm in the storm, a new center of agricultural innovation and advanced machinery production. As John Deere falters under the weight of outdated strategy and rising costs, Canada isn't just watching. It's building. John Deere's calculated response. Cautious engagement with Canada. As Canada positions itself as a stable refuge for manufacturing and agritech innovation, John Deere is quietly but seriously evaluating its northern neighbor's offer. The crisis at home, rising labor tensions, hostile trade policies, and shrinking export reliability has forced the company into a corner. Canada, with its skilled labor force, predictable regulatory climate, and access to global markets, is suddenly more than just a friendly neighbor. It's a strategic lifeline. Initial outreach. Behind closed doors. Deere executives have reportedly held confidential meetings with Canadian trade officials and provincial representatives from Ontario and Saskatchewan. While no formal announcements have been made, insiders suggest that Deere is exploring joint venture opportunities, tech sharing programs, and limited production shifting, particularly in the electric and autonomous farm equipment sectors. Balancing act, not a full exit, but a diversification. John Deere is walking a tightrope. It cannot afford to abandon its US identity, but it also cannot ignore the economic logic of diversification. Canada isn't being viewed as a backup, it's a potential parallel supply chain. Deere is investigating localized assembly in Ontario, closer collaboration with Canadian robotics firms, and an R&D partnership with agricultural AI labs in Saskatchewan. Internal friction and union sensitivities. However, any move northward is politically sensitive. Deere's US labor unions have already raised red flags, warning against offshoring under the guise of geopolitical stability. Deere executives are countering that Canadian expansion is not about outsourcing, it's about survival in a destabilized global market. EV farm equipment as the wedge. The biggest potential growth area? Electric and autonomous farm machinery. With EV adoption lagging in the US heartland, but gaining policy traction in Canada and Europe, Deere sees Canada as a launchpad for global export, a place to build the future while the US sorts out its past. The bottom line. Deere eyes the border, but treads lightly. John Deere's response to Canada's open door is neither a full embrace nor outright rejection. It's a pragmatic pivot, a slow but deliberate exploration of alternatives. With US industrial policy in disarray, Canada may not be the backup plan. It may be Plan B in motion.